So let me ask you a question. Have you experienced in the last couple years an awakening, a realization that something is fundamentally wrong and you didn't know what to do? Um, if that's happened, you're like a lot of people all over the country. Um, and as we've gone into COVID and elections and so many other things and riots, a lot of folks have reached that same conclusion, and I did too. My name's Jon Tigges. I founded the Patriot Pub Alliance about a year ago to address and to ultimately try to solve this problem. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of our story, and I hope that it helps you as well in addressing your question of what can I do. Um, Story goes back to where I came from. Um, I live in Loudin County, Virginia, and Loudin County over the last year became well known as kind of the epicenter of this big school board fights. Um, in that county, a few courageous people changed the minds and hearts of hundreds of thousands of citizens all over Virginia and inspired a lot of the rest of the country that things could change. And interestingly enough, a lot of people thought that the lesson from that was some sort of great political strategy or some sort of secret that nobody else knew. And I'm here to tell you, as someone who was directly involved with that, that the real answer is quite different. The real answer was actually that people began to engage in a spiritual war, an epic struggle, honestly. And we learned something in that, and we learned an approach that goes back to the beginning of time, honestly. And I want to share that with you because I think it'll help. So let me begin with my own past. I'm a retired Air Force guy, retired in 2006, went about thinking I was going to get out of government and didn't. Ended up right back as a Beltway bandit consultant and frankly did not want to do government anymore. And in the process of living on our little 24-acre farm, we stumbled into the event business and realized I could off-ramp into that, and I was going to be able to spend the rest of my life throwing parties and having other people pay me to show up. I thought that was a pretty good, comfortable life and was happy to fade away from all the crazy government stuff and go about living on our little farm. And along comes COVID as we went into our first projected cash flow positive year. And immediately realized after the 14 days to stop the spread that this was not going to stop, and was very activated because my very business and lifestyle was dependent upon staying open. And I had a governor that had essentially seized our property and was not going to open up again at least until July, and we couldn't survive. So I didn't know necessarily what to do, but my representative turned to me and said, "John, we're a minority party here in Virginia. It's completely run by the left, but you would make a really good plaintiff." So I sued the governor and then proceeded to start to protest in the streets of our local community and was joined by a handful of other people. And interestingly enough, I was surprised that more people didn't join us. I thought it was so obvious that this was COVID in particular was clearly a political stunt that was being used in so many ways to control people and to make the situation look bad. And then they began to, change the rules on elections as well. And I couldn't believe the only people that really would join us on the streets were people who had fled tyranny from other country. The Cubans, the Venezuelans, the boat people, the Iranians, the Eastern Bloc people. They clearly understood something that they'd seen before was happening in this country. But most normal Americans were afraid to say anything. And it really shocked me. But we continued protesting all the way up to the election, thinking there's no way that some guy, living in a basement was going to beat a guy who was having sellout crowds all over the country. And leading up to the election, we got a little concerned when the Hunter Biden laptop story was completely suppressed. And like you, I woke up the day after wondering what happened. Go to bed looking like Trump had won. Woke up and seeing all these middle of the night spikes and other anomalies as time went on that caused us to question whether our entire country had been subverted. Continuing that forward, I went to protest in a different way at our Capitol at the what was called then the Stop the Steal rally, thinking just as we had done on the streets of Leesburg, we would present our grievances. And what happened next, in a very low-energy event, was seeing that clearly as we walked up to the Capitol and people were hanging from the retaining walls of the Capitol when they could just walk around 100 feet around, that something seriously had gone wrong. And left that day wondering how in the world someone could be shot without warning, and how in the world things had gotten so out of hand. And this narrative now had been shifted to what they called an insurrection. Very quickly, many of the people that had protested with me started writing after January 6th as best they could and stating that their accounts had been canceled on social media. They were afraid to say anything for fear of being fired, particularly those that worked in the federal government, which in our area many people do, and saying what could they do. And I stepped back and started asking myself, what did we do before social media? What did we do? How did we communicate? What was the public square? And I was struck as I had looked at some history lessons that our Declaration of Independence and Constitution were formed in the public houses and churches of our colonial past. People getting together, breaking bread, having a pint, discussing, and cussing. And the things they cussed about, they did something about. And I thought that model maybe would work still today. So having an event venue, I decided to open it up, put on some wings on the deep fat fryer and get a pint, and let's see what happens. And that began with 2 or 3 dozen people gathering together. And the first couple meetings were amazing. What we found out was that people so desperately needed to not be alone anymore and to realize there was other people who thought like they did and had real serious concerns. I mean, there was literally people crying. They were so overtaken with the fact that there was other people of like heart and mind. Well, that continued. And we began to let people begin to share with everyone else their concerns. And certainly there was concerns about COVID, and there was concerns as well about the election and suppression. But it was a group of moms that shared one night that said they had grown really concerned about what was going on in the schools. That they had discovered as they were watching and observing their kids getting lessons piped into their home, that there was lessons about things like transgender issues that kids were supposed to accept and sexualization of all sorts of topics. And another big concern was that there was this divisive racial theory that appeared to be being taught in all sorts of different ways. And one of the ladies that attended said, who happens to be African American, said, you mean I'm supposed to tell my kids to hate their white dad and only love me? He goes, that seems kind of mixed up. Where's that going to end? She says, I'll go to your school board meeting and share. And she did. Her name's Chantel Cooper. She shared that at the Loudin County School Board meeting. It was recorded, and it went viral. Almost 2 million views in the next day or two. It led to her going on practically every national conservative network, and a lot of people got their attention, particularly in our county. And more people started to join at the school board meetings. In fact, at the next school board meeting, a teacher by the name of Tanner Cross was inspired to say, if Chantel can speak, I should be sharing because I'm seeing it firsthand. And Tanner spoke that as a Christian, he couldn't call a boy a girl and a girl a boy. The next day he was fired. That got a lot more attention. And quickly we were having, instead of 2 or 3 dozen people gathering together, the word spread, and we had 200 or 300 people gathering together at our weekly meeting. And at that point, we decided to start to do more than just show up. We decided we needed to organize, and we needed to take these disparate groups and work and collaborate together. And people started uniting in this common cause against evil. And it was clear and present evil that everyone could recognize. And that's what we did. The next meeting, we got everyone we could to sign up to speak. And almost 300 people signed up. And over 1,000 people showed up for the meeting itself, filling the room to capacity and overflowing. And the school board clearly was not liking it. So what was their response? We're only going to give you 60 seconds. You can make no noise or you will be shut down. The only thing they were going to allow was jazz hands. And if you can believe that, we still proceeded. And before the process even began, there was some serious concerns that went out because the superintendent, in queuing up these new transgender, it's called the 80-40 policy of opening up all the bathrooms to whoever wants to identify as whatever, stated that not only was there never been a problem with transgender ideology affecting sexualization or other issues in the school, but he stated that there had never been a single sexual assault reported in Loudin County schools, and that people shouldn't have to worry about this. At that point, the various public comment began, starting with a whole string of leftists at the beginning of the process. And that was frustrating to people because clearly they had been given advanced access to sign up, and all of them, all 12 of them, spoke first. But after they got done, came a string of conservatives, one after another, people, young people, old people, parents, children, students, all one after another, hammering on the fact that they had real concerns about where the public school was going, the ideological indoctrination that was taking place, and the lack of education. And finally, about 50 people in, Senator Dick Black, a retired former Marine colonel, got up and nailed the issue in 60 seconds, one point after another. And when he finished, instead of jazz hands, there was a pregnant pause and complete eruption of applause and shouting because people were so taken how powerfully he had made his point. And before the applause died down, the school board stood up and funneled out of the room, stating that public comment was over because of applause in favor of a position. And at that point, you could feel the room. The angst, the anger was growing, and there was shouting, and in one corner, people began to sing the national anthem, and a lot of people joined in, and I happened to be sitting front and center and asking myself, how in the world do we keep this from blowing up, and how can we continue? And I believe the Lord told me, reminded me that for 26 weeks you've learned that if you're in a public place and you're giving public testimony peacefully, you have every right to be there. And that room had been scheduled till 7 o'clock for public comment. So as the national anthem ended, I stood up on the chair, knowing that about 200 or 300 people would recognize me, and ask them to be quiet, and reminding them that even though the school board didn't want to hear what you had to say, that we could hear from one another. and our grievances. We had the First Amendment right to have our grievances heard. And we're going to hear from one another, and oh, by the way, there happened to be some national feed cameras there as well, and that the rest of the country could hear how we felt as well. Well, you can imagine that the superintendent didn't like that they weren't able to just drive people out of that room. And after about 30 minutes or so, you could tell that, and as we began to continue to hammer things, and they brought in a little Mr. Microphone, and now we actually had a way to project people's comments, it wasn't going well, and that we had essentially seized the initiative. And then way in the back of the room, a scuffle broke out. And you could see sheriff's officers tackling an individual, and I quickly thought for my own self that some of the Antifa agitators that were everywhere had an effect on somebody, but it went on, and we continued to, in fact, a lot of people didn't even notice, and we just continued to press our case and continue to give public comment. But the superintendent used that minor incident to declare the room an unlawful assembly. Now, you may or may not have heard that term, but after 26 weeks of protest, I knew exactly what that meant. And it's a legal term, and it means that our protest was violent. And it clearly wasn't violent. The only thing that was violent was sheriff's officers tackling a guy from behind. And everybody else in the room had been peacefully listening to one another for over 45 minutes. So we continued. And a few minutes after that, he came back on, and the superintendent stated again, "I declare this an unlawful assembly, and if you do not exit the room, you will be arrested for trespassing." And this time, he dispatched about 24 sheriff deputies who were there as rent-a-cops, taking orders from the superintendent to clear the room of people peacefully protesting. It was shocking, and many people became enraged and challenged those deputies head on, and they continued to illegally tell people they were going to be arrested while peacefully protesting. Several of us continued to stand. Many people, when confronted with a uniformed officer, departed. And finally, with a handful of us left, the deputy turned to me and asked me if I was refusing to leave, and I told him I was staying until everyone had a chance to speak. At that point, they cuffed me, they hauled me off in front of the building where hundreds of people had gathered in front of a paddy wagon and made a public display of placing me in it and driving away. I figured at that point my next stop was the county jail. And when we continued for about 30 minutes driving around, I didn't know where we were because you can't see anything in the paddy wagon. But when they opened the door, instead of being at the magistrate's office, we were in the back parking lot of the building. They took me, brought me down, cited me with trespassing, which I told them I don't see any way I could be trespassing in a public place where I was giving public comment. And the officer said, "Well, trust me, you were, and I'll tell you in the next 24 hours exactly how." Well, that never happened and still hasn't happened, and we're still fighting that case. But the important thing was a lot of other people thought there was something fundamentally wrong with that action. And in the next 24 hours, I did over a dozen interviews all over feeds, locally, nationally, Tucker, and now Loudin County had blown up. The white shining light of truth was starting to take hold. And we decided that we were going to push the initiative now, and that maybe we could actually change the minds of these school board people with ongoing pressure. And interestingly enough, people from all over the country started taking notice, and other school boards started popping off, and people began to press the issue and found the same issues in their school boards. And those began to go forward. And while this is all going on, we happen to have this thing called an election in Virginia. We're an odd year election cycle, so we kind of stand out. And it's the first election since the 2020 election. The Democratic candidate, Terry McAuliffe, was the former chair of the Democratic National Committee. He started out the race 15 points up in a state that went 6 points for Biden. And no one thought that the Republican candidate, who had never run for political office before, a guy named Glenn Youngkin, stood a chance. But Glenn Youngkin was savvy enough to realize that something was happening in the schools. And he began to campaign on that issue along with the usual Republican, government, business, etc. But education had never really been a Republican position before. But he began to campaign on that. And he started to see very minor change in movement as people started going, I maybe need to think differently about what's going on and what these left woke policies are really doing. But a guy by the name of Matt Walsh also showed up. And he's one of the famous commentators in Daily Wire. And the school board began to try to find more ways to suppress. And one of the ways they tried to suppress was moving everybody outside and bringing people in one at a time. And then they put masks on people. And in Matt Walsh's case, they said, we're not going to allow you to speak unless you're from Loudin County. So we had him sign a short-term lease to a basement of one of the individuals in our group. And Matt spoke. And that was fun and interesting. But the more significant thing was Matt became aware of something while he was there that many of us knew about but couldn't say anything about. And that was that the other individual that got arrested the day that I did, who was tackled from behind by sheriff's deputies, wasn't there because he was trying to cause a problem. He was there because of a problem. And the problem was his daughter, 3 weeks previously, had been raped in a girl's bathroom by a young man wearing a skirt. And he was concerned that the situation wasn't handled very well and that it appeared that it was being covered up. And he knew it was being covered up when the superintendent said there had not been any reported sexual assaults in Loudin County. In any case, Matt sicked a investigative reporter after the situation, a guy named Luke Rosiak, and he began to research the situation to figure out what really happened. Fast forward a couple months and a whole lot more school board meetings, a whole lot more ruckus. In spite of all of our efforts, in spite of even teachers resigning, the dial had not moved in the election. It was still a double-digit deficit for Youngkin, and we're 2 weeks before the election. And suddenly I get a text from that father. His name's Scott Smith, and I'd gotten to know him a little bit throughout the process, but he texted me and said, John, I'm ready to go public with this. Up to that point, he was told by his lawyers and others that if he went public, it was not going to go well for his daughter. And I was surprised that suddenly he had changed his mind. I said, Scott, why? He goes, the superintendent released the perpetrator back into another high school, and he assaulted another girl. And he says, at this point, I don't care. I am not going to allow anyone else to suffer because I'm not willing to step forward. Mm-hmm. Story goes out on the Daily Wire, and by 10 o'clock, Scott was on Laura Ingraham, and everything blew up. Suddenly, so many people who Scott Smith and his picture of being arrested and bloodied and his pants hanging down to his knees, who was pictured as a domestic terrorist by the Attorney General of the United States, suddenly this guy, people realized, had been misrepresented, and that all he cared about was protecting his daughter and now protecting his community. It changed hearts and minds. It changed so many hearts and minds that by the time we got to the election, things shifted 15 points, and Glenn Youngkin was the victor, along with several other God-fearing candidates, our Lieutenant General Winsome Sears and Attorney General Jason Miyares. And on top of that, Republicans took back the House. Now, So many people afterwards looked at the situation, and pundits were literally flabbergasted that this could happen. It was really quite miraculous. And they thought there was some sort of, crazy political strategy or something that had gone on. And yet many people looked and said, you know what? It really wasn't. What it really was a few courageous people, courageous parents, courageous teachers, courageous plumber, stepping forward to oppress or to contest a near and present darkness and evil that had subverted the community. And when we, within the Patriot Pub and the various folks that have been involved in this, looked and said, all of our efforts, all of our collaboration, were great. They shined a bright light, but it really was a few courageous people that made the difference. And the other thing that became really clear to us was that none of this would have happened if we hadn't started in unity, meeting together, eating together, developing trust with one another. And it was very interesting that after the election, many of the people who had political leanings kind of did their own thing, started new PACs, went on to new appointments. But the people that remain, and the people to this day that are committed, what they really are, they're Christians. And they're Christians from all walks of life. Everything from Pentecostals to Orthodox Catholics. And what we really saw was a citywide or community-wide church, ecclesia, it's called in the Bible, working together, trusting with one another, and not caring about who got the credit. And it was supernatural. But the beginning point was breaking bread, developing trust and unity, and agreeing on what was true and what needed to be addressed. And many other local communities started coming to us and saying, how do we do this? Give us the secret sauce. So we told Prince William County and Fairfax County people, start meeting together, start eating together. And they started having similar success as they started doing it. And they were shocked at how simple that process was. However, we needed then to unite them together. So we invested in a platform that we discovered that was actually built originally for the underground church. So instead of giving away our privacy or getting canceled at a moment's notice by Zuckerberg or Google or whoever else, we actually had our own secure military-grade encryption platform to communicate, collaborate, and mobilize. And we began to see success with that. And so, strangely, this message, and as we reflected, we began to realize the core message isn't about the usual fleshly response, which I was guilty of, which was, I'm angry, I'm going to rage against the machine, and we're going to protest and make noise and hate people. What we began to really realize is what we discovered in 2 Chronicles 7:14, which tells us that if my people who are called by my ways will humble themselves, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, I will forgive their sins and heal their land. We began to realize that as Christians, we had failed. We had grown comfortable. I certainly had grown comfortable. And we were seeking a happiness that was void of God. That reality was humbling, but it also was powerful. And so the message that I have to you and to anyone else that calls upon the name of the Lord is that the starting point is not raging against Washington, D.C. or an individual, and not a solution that's going to be political. That's downstream. That comes as a result of changed hearts and minds. It starts with us addressing the evil in our own hearts and realizing that God's eternal purpose was to unite his people, and that his people be a reflection of the beauty and love that he is. And that's why the most foundational principle Jesus gave us, the greatest commandment, was to love him and love our neighbor as ourselves. And then to go out and make disciples, teaching them everything that he had commanded us, which is to love one another and to give them the truth, certainly of the gospel, but the truth as well that sets people free. And so that's what we've been doing as part of the Patriot Pub. And in order to take back this nation, one small group here and one small group over there is not going to win the counterinsurgency. As a military person, counterinsurgency, the key is changing hearts and minds, and ultimately to gather enough forces that you can regain your country. And the Patriot Pub Alliance, I came from Virginia here to Santa Barbara to get the word out to people like the people here that if you unite together, focus on the truth, and ultimately help liberate your local community, that if this community is liberated and that community is liberated, pretty soon we have our nation back. But it's going to take an army. And so we're looking to unite this army of patriots who are willing to first examine their own hearts and then change their country. And that's our goal. So if you want to join with us in that, I encourage you to go to patriotpuballiance.com, subscribe to our platform, and when you do that, if you're the first person in your community, we'll actually set up a node and we'll start helping you get together with other people of like heart and mind. And our goal is, I think, just aligns with God's heart. He wants abundance. He wants a reflection of him in this world. And we saw in Loudin County that a few courageous people can make a difference. And we think that with your help here in Santa Barbara or Boise or wherever you are, that this country can be won back. Come join us.